parking lot attendant almost waved him away. He could not be blamed for that. What Marcus Reed drove that evening was not a car so much as a memory of one, a rusted, paint-peeled, door-creaking relic that coughed gray smoke from its exhaust, like an old man rising too quickly from a chair. The body panels were mismatched, one fender the color of dried blood, the other a flaking shade of olive that might have been green once, decades ago, in a different life. The chrome had gone gray, the headlights were fogged with age. Every seam along the chassis had surrendered to rust that spread like slow, patient roots. And yet, Marcus drove it, with the quiet steadiness of a man who had decided, long ago, that the opinions of strangers held exactly no weight over his life. He did not hurry. He did not apologize with his eyes. He simply drove, one hand loose on the wheel, the other resting on the doorframe where the window glass had long since been replaced by nothing at all. His name was Marcus Reed, and he was 41 years old, and he smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee, no matter how hard he scrubbed before leaving the house. He lived in a rented garage apartment on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood where the roads cracked at the edges and the street lamps flickered on cold nights. He fixed engines for a living, not at a shop with a sign out front, but from word of mouth, neighbor to neighbor, a folded bill pressed into his palm in the driveway, a handshake and a thank you, and the quiet satisfaction of having made something work again. He was not poor in the way that kept him awake at night, but he was not comfortable in the way that allowed him to stop thinking about money. He was exactly between those two things, suspended there by discipline and habit, and the particular kind of pride that belongs to men who build things with their hands and do not talk about it. He had a daughter. Her name was Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was staying that weekend with his sister across town because Marcus had something he needed to do alone. He had told Lily only that he was going to a party for old cars. She had asked if the car they owned counted as old. He had said yes, probably older than she knew. She had said good. That meant it was important. He had not corrected her. He had kissed her forehead and driven away. The car itself, the rusted, wheezing, olive and blood-red contraption he piloted through the city, had cost him $120. He had bought it 8 months ago from a salvage yard on the far edge of town, a place where cars went to become parts and eventually became nothing at all. The owner of the yard, a heavyset man named Gerald who wore the same oil-stained cap every day of his life, had told Marcus the car was scheduled for crushing that Thursday. Marcus had asked if he could look at it first. Gerald had said, "Sure. Go ahead, nobody's stopping you. It's just going to be scrap." Marcus had spent 40 minutes crouching beneath it, running his hands along the frame, pressing his fingernail into rust patches to test the metal underneath. Gerald had come back and found him still there and said, "You want to buy it?" Marcus had said $100. Gerald had said $120, and you haul it yourself. Marcus had said deal. His neighbors had opinions about this. The woman next door, who kept an immaculate Honda and watched the block with the vigilance of a lighthouse, had come out onto her porch and watched the flatbed deposit the wreck in Marcus's driveway with an expression that suggested she was already composing a note to the landlord. The teenage boys down the street had slowed their bikes and laughed openly, not even bothering to hide it. One of them had called out something about a parade float. Marcus had not responded. He had unhitched the winch cable, paid the driver, and begun pushing the car toward the garage. For 8 months, in the evenings after work and on weekend mornings before Lily woke, he had taken it apart and put it back together. He replaced the fuel lines. He rebuilt the carburetor, with parts sourced from 3 different states. He machined a new gasket himself because the original size did not exist in any catalog he could find. He stripped rust with navel jelly and wire brush and patience, working section by section, learning the car's body, the way a doctor learns an anatomy, where things were, what connected to what had been stressed and what had been spared. The engine had been the last thing he touched, and it had taken him 6 weeks alone, working by lamplight in the garage while the neighborhood slept, reassembling something that the decades had nearly destroyed. It was during that work, during the slow disassembly of the engine block, that he had first noticed something odd. There were markings on the underside of the intake manifold, not stamped markings. Not the usual alphanumeric codes of a production run, but hand-engraved lines, deliberate and precise, a kind of notation that suggested a person rather than a machine had made them. He had photographed them and then kept going, because the engine needed finishing, and he did not have time to chase curiosities. But the photographs sat in his phone, unnamed in a folder, waiting, and then the envelope had arrived. Plain white, no return address. A printed label with his name spelled correctly, despite the fact that he had never given his address to anyone associated with the event it described. Inside was an invitation to the Westfield Invitational Automotive Exhibition and Private Auction, to be held at the Meridian Grand Hotel on the 14th. Black tie preferred. Exhibit vehicles expected by 7. There was a handwritten note clipped to it. Bring the car. No signature. Marcus had stood in his kitchen for a long time holding that note. Then he had looked at the photographs on his phone. Then he had put on a clean shirt and gone. The Meridian Grand Hotel occupied an entire city block downtown. It had been built in the era when buildings were designed to make people feel small on purpose, grand stone facades, columns wider than Marcus's car, lobby ceilings high enough to house a second floor, if anyone had been so inclined. Tonight, it blazed with light. Valets in burgundy jackets moved with choreographed efficiency across the forecourt, which was already lined with automobiles that cost more than Marcus had earned in the last decade combined. A Bugatti sat under a portable lighting rig. A pre-war Duesenberg gleamed behind velvet rope. 3 separate men in identical dark suits stood beside a Ferrari prototype, arms crossed, watching. The air smelled of money and careful attention. Marcus turned off the main road and into the hotel drive, and the engine of his $120 car chose that moment with the impeccable timing that only machines and small children possess to stall. It shuddered. It coughed. It died. He coasted the last 30 feet to the entrance on momentum alone, stopping just short of the valet podium with a soft metallic groan. The silence that followed was almost musical. A valet stared at him, then at the car, then at him again. In the crowd gathered along the entrance steps, collectors, dealers, journalists, and the kind of wealthy enthusiasts who owned garages larger than most homes. A ripple moved through the standing bodies. Not laughter, not yet, just recognition of something unusual, something that did not compute against the setting. Someone made a comment, and someone else laughed. And then the laughter was general, unhurried, the comfortable laughter of people who have never had to choose between being embarrassed and being honest. Victoria Hale appeared at the top of the entrance stairs at precisely that moment. She had a gift for timing, or rather, she arranged her life so that timing served her, never the other way around. She was 44 years old, and the chief executive officer of Hale Automotive, a luxury vehicle company that her father had built from a single dealership into an international brand, and that she had spent 15 years expanding, refining, and protecting with the intensity of someone who has inherited something irreplaceable and knows it. She wore a charcoal gown that had cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. Her hair was a sharp chestnut, cut with surgical precision. Her face was beautiful in the way that certain expensive objects are beautiful cold, composed, designed to impress rather than to welcome. She looked at the car. She looked at Marcus. And then, because she had always found cruelty easiest when she was certain of her audience, she descended 3 steps and spoke loudly enough to be heard across the forecourt. "Is this a joke? Who let this in?" She tilted her head at the car as though examining something found on the bottom of a shoe. "That thing looks like it was dragged in from a demolition site." Which it probably was. She turned to the nearest security guard. A large, patient-looking man who had heard orders like this before. "Have it removed. It's damaging the optics of the entire entrance." Marcus had not moved. He sat behind the wheel of the dead car with his hands in his lap, watching her the way a man watches weather, noting it, categorizing it, making no attempt to argue with it. "Your vehicle is blocking the entrance," Victoria said directly to him now. Crisp and final. Whatever you thought this was, I assure you, it isn't. This is a private event for serious collectors. I have an invitation, Marcus said. His voice was the same temperature as his expression. Even. Unhurried. Everyone has an invitation. That doesn't mean, Victoria. A voice from the crowd. Not loud, but carrying. The kind of voice that did not need volume because it had spent decades being listened to. Victoria. Stop. The crowd parted slightly not because it was asked to, but because people instinctively make room for authority that does not announce itself. An old man moved through the gap. He was perhaps 75, lean in the way that age makes some men lean, with thick white hair and hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime inside engines. He wore a dark suit that fit him well, and carried a flashlight, a small, powerful LED model in his left hand, which was unusual enough that several people glanced at it. His name was Leonard Voss, and if you moved in circles where automobile history mattered, that name landed with the weight of decades. He had authenticated more rare vehicles than any other living expert. He had testified in 3 international court cases involving stolen automotive heritage. He had written 2 books, both considered definitive, both out of print. He was the guest of honor tonight, though he arrived without announcement and expected no fuss about it. He was not looking at Victoria. He was looking at Marcus's car. More precisely, he was looking at the lower quarter panel just behind the passenger door, where a patch of rust had been partially cleaned during Marcus's restoration work, and where, in the gap between 2 body panels, something small and deliberate was just barely visible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. Pull around to the side, Leonard said to Marcus. Keep the car out of traffic. Don't let anyone else near it. Sir, Victoria began. I don't know who you think. I know exactly who I think, Victoria. And right now I need you to be quiet. He said it without malice, simply as a statement of operational necessity. She went quiet, which surprised her almost as much as it surprised the people watching. Leonard walked to the car. He pressed it close to the gap between the panels, angling the light, and was still for a long moment. The crowd had gone almost silent by now, sensing something they could not name. Marcus stood a few feet away. Watching, Leonard reached out and touched the frame rail with one finger. He pressed. He pulled back his hand and looked at his fingertip. He shone the light again, at a different angle. Then he stood up very slowly and said, in a voice that had lost some of its composure, "Where did you get this vehicle?" "Salvage yard," Marcus said. "How long ago?" 8 months. "Have you opened the engine?" "Yes." Leonard turned to look at him directly for the first time. "And what did you find?" "I found it needed a lot of work," Marcus said. "So I did the work." Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to see the engine. I need to see it now, in front of witnesses. Will you allow that?" Marcus considered this. "You want to pop the hood in the hotel driveway?" "I want to pop the hood wherever you're comfortable popping it, but I'd prefer here. And I'd prefer now. Because I'm an old man, and I don't have patience for delay." He looked around at the crowd, which had grown larger without anyone appearing to have moved toward it. "I need 6 people who are qualified to verify what they're looking at. Armand, Cole, Reyes, get over here." 3 men detached from the crowd. They were the kind of men who wore their expertise the way other men wore expensive watches, not flaunted, but present and unmistakable. They came forward, without questions. "What is happening?" Victoria said. Her voice had changed. The crispness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted a small, almost imperceptible frequency of unease. "That," Leonard said, pointing at Marcus's car, "is what is happening. Now please, stand back." Marcus opened the hood. The latch stuck, the way it always did, and he had to press down slightly before lifting. The hood rose with a creak that would have been comic in any other setting. The engine underneath was not beautiful in the way that show cars are beautiful, chrome-polished, and posed for admiration. It was clean because Marcus had made it clean, and it was functional because Marcus had made it functional. But it was old, and its age showed in the design of its components, in the architecture of its assembly, in the way certain parts fit together in ways that modern engines had stopped fitting together 50 years ago. It was the engine of a different era. And not just any different era. Leonard looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he said nothing for another 10. Then he reached into his breast pocket and removed a jeweler's loupe, the kind used to examine fine details at magnification, and he pressed it to his eye and leaned over the engine block and read something that was engraved, very small, into the metal near the valve cover. He read it twice. He stood up. "I need someone to confirm the chassis number," he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. Armand. Armand, a compact Frenchman in his 60s who was considered the foremost authority on European pre-war sports cars, crouched at the front of the vehicle with his own light. He was quiet for 30 seconds. When he stood, he looked at Leonard and said only, "Yes." "Cole," Leonard said. Cole, younger, American, a specialist in American muscle and prototype vehicles of the 1960s through 1980s, pressed his light against the driver's door jamb and read the stamp there. He looked up. He said, "That is not a production stamp." "No," Leonard said. "It isn't." The crowd had gone very quiet. Even the valets had stopped moving. Even the traffic on the street beyond the hotel entrance seemed to have reduced itself to a hush, as though the city itself was listening. Victoria Hale had her arms crossed. She was standing very still. "What you are looking at," Leonard said, turning to face the assembled crowd with the calm of a man delivering a lecture he has been preparing for his entire career, "is a vehicle I have been told no longer existed. It was a prototype, a single chassis, hand-built, designed by a man who believed that the future of high-performance automobiles lay in a direction that no manufacturer of his era was willing to follow. He was wrong about the timing and right about the engineering, which is the particular tragedy of genius. The vehicle was built, it was tested, it was documented, and then it disappeared. That was approximately 41 years ago. I have, in 41 years, never seen it. I was not certain I would ever see it." He paused. "Until tonight," someone in the crowd said. "How much?" Leonard looked at them for a moment, as though deciding whether the question deserved an answer. "The value of a one-of-one prototype by one of the most significant automotive designers of the 20th century, with original components intact and documented provenance, cannot be guessed at from a driveway. What I can tell you is that the last comparable discovery, and there has been nothing truly comparable in the 40 years I have been doing this, sold for more than $4 million. And that vehicle was in worse condition than this one." Someone else in the crowd, not one of the experts, just a person who had come to look at expensive cars and had instead found a story, took out their phone. Victoria noticed. Her jaw tightened. "This is premature," she said loudly. "We don't have documentation. We don't have provenance chain. Anyone can put a special order engine into a shell. Anyone can manufacture markings. I'm not saying that's what happened here. But I'm saying we should not be standing in a hotel driveway making declarations about millions of dollars based on a flashlight examination." "You're correct that a thorough examination is required," Leonard said equably. "We should begin that tonight. In the meantime, I will say what I believe to be true, which is that this vehicle did not disappear by accident." He said nothing further. He did not need to. What he had said was already moving through the crowd, and the crowd was already moving in ways that crowds move when they have witnessed something they cannot stop talking about. Marcus stood beside the open hood of his $120 car and said nothing at all. A journalist named Cressida Park had been covering the automotive beat for 9 years, long enough to know that the story that had just walked into a hotel driveway was not an automotive story. She found Marcus the next morning at the salvage yard where he had bought the car, because Gerald was the kind of man who talked freely and without any sense that privacy was a concept that applied to him. Cressida was not aggressive by nature, but she was persistent, and she had the particular talent of asking questions in a way that made people feel they were doing her a favor, rather than giving something away. Marcus answered her questions with his usual economy. He confirmed the price he had paid. He confirmed the process of restoration. He did not dramatize either of these things. When she asked why he had kept the car, when everyone around him had called it worthless, He looked at her for a moment and said, "Because I knew it wasn't." She asked how he knew. "Some things you can't explain," he said. "You look at a piece of machinery and you understand it. It's either there or it isn't." He paused. The markings on the engine helped. She asked what he meant by that, and he told her about the hand-engraved notations on the intake manifold. She asked if he recognized the style of the notation. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I thought I did. I didn't let myself believe it." Cressida was good at silence. She waited. "I had a teacher," Marcus said. "Years ago, when I was working in engineering. A real engineer, not the kind who manages, the kind who designs. He had a way of marking his work. Personal, like a signature, but not a signature. It was his private notation system for prototypes and one-off builds, things he didn't want anyone else to modify without understanding what he'd intended." He paused again. His name was Howard Bledsoe. He died 7 years ago, and the notation on that engine looks like his. Cressida wrote that name down. What she found when she searched it was the beginning of something much larger than a car story. Howard Bledsoe had been an engineer of exceptional ability who had worked, in the early 1980s, for a company that no longer existed under that name, a specialty automotive design firm that had been acquired, restructured, and rebranded over the course of 2 decades until it had become, in its current form, Hale Automotive. Bledsoe had left that company under disputed circumstances in 1983. There were accounts in trade publications, in the kind of industry gossip that hardens into informal record, of a project he had been developing, a prototype vehicle, and of that project being taken from him before he could complete it. The accounts were vague because the people involved had been careful, and because Bledsoe himself had, in the years after, declined to discuss it publicly. Victoria Hale's father, Robert Hale, had run the company during that period. Marcus did not know any of this when Cressida asked to speak with him a second time, 2 days after the hotel driveway. He knew that the man who had taught him most of what he understood about engines had been treated badly by an industry that had taken his ideas and returned nothing. He knew that because Howard had told him, in the quiet way Howard told things, over 2 years of working in the same shop in the early 2000s, when Marcus was 23 and trying to figure out what to do with his ability, and Howard was 60 and trying to figure out what to do with what remained of his anger. Howard had told him, "They will take whatever you build if you let them. The only protection you have is knowing more than they do and not making them afraid of it." Marcus had thought about that advice for almost 20 years. He had, in some ways, organized his life around it, staying small, staying quiet, fixing engines in a garage, not giving anyone reason to notice him or want what he had. But the staying small had not always been a choice freely made. Before the garage, before the freelance work and the rented apartment and the quiet rhythms of East Side life, Marcus had been someone the industry had briefly paid attention to. He had graduated top of his class from a state technical college, and then, against the advice of nearly everyone who knew him, turned down a salaried engineering position at a Detroit manufacturer to work in a small independent design shop because the design shop was doing work that interested him, and the manufacturer was doing work that paid well, and at 23, he had not yet understood that interesting and well-paying were not always the enemies of each other, but that you rarely got both from the same source. He had worked at that small shop for 3 years and produced 2 engine configurations that the owner of the shop, a man who wore good suits and spoke confidently about collaboration, had submitted under his own firm's name to a consortium of investors. Marcus had received a raise. The designs had received a licensing agreement worth substantially more than that raise. He had asked, once, whether his name would appear in the patent documentation. He had been told, once, that credit in this industry worked differently than he might expect. He had left the shop 2 weeks later and spent the following month doing nothing, which was the closest he had ever come to a breakdown, and then he had started fixing cars in a borrowed garage because the work was honest, and the result was visible, and no one could take it from him once it was done. Howard Bledsoe had found him during that period, the way certain mentors find certain students, not through any formal mechanism, but through the gravity of shared attention paid to the same things. Howard had a bench at a community workshop where Marcus occasionally rented space, and they had worked side by side for several months before Howard said anything beyond the practical necessities of shared work, and when he did finally speak, it was to ask Marcus a question about a fuel delivery problem Marcus was working on, and Marcus had answered it correctly, and Howard had said, simply, which meant, in Howard's particular vocabulary, something closer to "I see you" than any more elaborate acknowledgement. That was how it had started, and in the 2 years that followed, Howard had taught Marcus things about engineering that no classroom had touched, not technical facts, which Marcus largely knew, but the philosophy of making, the ethics of authorship, the particular discipline required to build something genuinely new, in a world that preferred profitable versions of what already existed. Howard had been careful with Marcus in a way that Marcus only understood in retrospect, careful in the way of someone who has been hurt enough times that they want to ensure the person they are teaching is ready for what the world does to original work. Howard had told him, "They will take whatever you build if you let them. The only protection you have is knowing more than they do and not making them afraid of it." Marcus had thought about that advice for almost 20 years. He had, in some ways, organized his life around it, staying small, staying quiet, fixing engines in a garage, not giving anyone reason to notice him or want what he had. But now someone had wanted his car, and it was too late for quiet. Victoria Hale moved quickly. She always moved quickly. It was one of the things she valued most about herself, the ability to assess a situation and respond before anyone else had finished processing what the situation was. She had her legal team contact Marcus within 48 hours of the hotel event. The offer was presented as straightforward, a private purchase, fair market value, as assessed by a firm of their choosing, clean transaction, no media involvement. Marcus read the offer, which was substantial more money than he had made in the previous 5 years, and then he set it on the kitchen table and left it there for a day, the way he left problems that needed thinking rather than deciding. When he came back to it, he called the number on the letterhead and spoke to a lawyer who was very polished and very patient and who said all the right things in the right order. Marcus asked, "Who commissioned the assessment?" The lawyer said the firm was independent. Marcus asked, "Independent of whom, specifically?" There was a pause. Marcus said he would need to think about it. He did not call back. The offer was withdrawn and replaced 4 days later by something different. There were stories in 2 different automotive publications suggesting that the vehicle's provenance was questionable, that the markings might be added after the fact, that the chassis number did not match records that Hale Automotive's historical archive had been unable to locate. The stories were attributed to unnamed sources with expertise in automotive authentication. They were careful. They stopped just short of calling Marcus a fraud. But they established the question clearly enough that it would be difficult to unestablish. Marcus read the stories. He drove to Leonard Voss's workshop, which was on the 2nd floor of a converted textile building in the warehouse district, and sat down across from the old man and told him what had happened. Leonard listened without interruption. When Marcus finished, Leonard was quiet for a moment, and then said, "That's what I expected. Why? Because I've been in this industry for 50 years, and this isn't the first time someone has tried to disappear a car that told an inconvenient story." He leaned forward. "The prototype you found, Howard Bledsoe's prototype, was supposed to be destroyed. I know this because Howard told me, years before he died. He told me that someone had ordered it crushed, that it had been removed from the company before he could get to it. He didn't know what had happened to it afterward." Leonard looked at Marcus steadily. "You found a car that was supposed to not exist anymore, which means someone, at some point, didn't follow through on destroying it. And now that it's surfaced, there are people who very much need it to be considered not genuine. Because of what it proves," Marcus said, "because of what it proves about who designed it, and who took credit for designing it, and who built a company on that credit." Leonard paused. Robert Hale presented that prototype concept to his investors in 1983 as his own design. He licensed the technology under his own name. He used the revenue from that licensing to acquire the capital that built Hale Automotive into what it became. His daughter runs that company today. If the design originated with Bledsoe, and it did, I know it did because I saw Howard's early drawings. I was there at the beginning of that project. Then the foundation of Hale Automotive's most profitable era is built on stolen work. Marcus sat with that for a moment. The car proves it? The car is the original physical evidence. The hand notations, the engine specifications, the prototype designation on the chassis. They match Bledsoe's documented method precisely. They predate Robert Hale's patent filings. Leonard paused. I should have pushed harder on this years ago. Howard wouldn't allow it. He was tired, and he didn't want the fight. But Howard is gone now, and the car isn't. What came next moved faster than Marcus had been prepared for. Leonard contacted 3 journalists, not the publications that had run the skeptical pieces, but older, more patient institutions that moved carefully and published rarely and were read by the people who made decisions. He provided documentation, Bledsoe's original design drawings, correspondence from the era, a paper trail of patent filings that, when laid alongside the prototype specifications, formed an argument that was difficult to dismiss. He provided the vehicle itself, submitting it to a formal independent authentication process run by a consortium of experts with no connection to any interested party. The authentication took 11 days. The result was unambiguous. The car was genuine. The design originated with Bledsoe. The evidence of the provenance was physical, chemical, and documented. There was no reasonable interpretation of the available data that supported any other conclusion. Hale Automotive's communications team released a statement saying the company was reviewing the findings. The statement was measured and corporate and said nothing, but the stock moved the day it was released downward, sharply, in the way that stocks move when the market decides that a company's story about itself has changed. Victoria Hale gave no interviews. She had been advised not to give interviews, but she was present everywhere that the story was being told, in the way that a person is present in the room when everyone is talking about them, her name in every sentence, her decisions in every paragraph, her father's choices, and her inheritance of those choices, and what she had known or not known, and when she had known or not known it. The board of directors met in an emergency session. The shareholders received a letter. 2 of the company's senior executives resigned within the same week, which told its own story. Victoria had spent 15 years becoming the most visible person in her industry. She had curated that visibility carefully, the profile pieces, the speaking engagements, the brand of disciplined excellence that attached itself to her name the way brands do when they are constructed rather than earned. All of it had assumed a foundation. The foundation was now, publicly, in question. She stood in her office on the 22nd floor of the Hale building on the morning that the authentication results were published, and looked out at the city below and understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that the position she occupied was not hers, the way she had always told herself it was hers. She had worked for it. That was true. She had also inherited it, and she had inherited not only the position and the company but the terms under which the company existed, and those terms had just been rewritten by an old man with a flashlight and a quiet mechanic with a $120 car. She thought about what she had said in the hotel driveway. She had not thought about it since that night had buried it under urgency and strategy and crisis management and the 1,000 tactical decisions of the weeks that followed. But now, in the silence of the office, with the city spread below her like evidence, she thought about it clearly. She had looked at a man she had never met and told him, in front of a crowd, that he did not belong. She had said it casually, reflexively, with the confidence of someone who has never once been made to feel that they did not belong anywhere. She had been wrong about the car. She had been wrong about the man. She had been right about nothing, except her ability to make cruelty look like standards. The auction was set for a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks after the authentication results were published. It was organized by a house that handled the most significant private sales in the world, a company that had moved single pieces for prices that made headlines in countries where the average annual income would not cover the buyer's premium. They sent a team to document the vehicle. They sent a specialist to consult on starting price. They issued a catalog entry that ran to 14 pages and was itself, within the collector community, something of an event. Marcus drove to the auction venue in a rented car. He had not been asked to bring the $120 vehicle, which was now housed in a climate-controlled storage unit that the auction house had arranged and which Marcus had visited twice in the past 6 weeks to check on it, the way a person checks on something they are responsible for even when others have technically taken over. The room was full. Not full in the way that regular auctions are full occupied, attended, functional, but full in the way that rooms are full when everyone present understands that something historic is about to happen and does not want to be anywhere else. There were collectors who had flown in from 3 continents. There were museum representatives. There were automotive journalists whose publications had readers in 40 countries. There were 2 men who had never attended an auction before in their lives, but who had read about this one and gotten on planes. Leonard sat in the front row. He had been asked to speak before the bidding opened, and he had spoken for 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than he usually allowed himself at such events, because this time there was something he wanted to say that had been waiting a long time to be said. He talked about Howard Bledsoe, not about the legal and historical dimensions of the story, which the catalog had covered, but about the man himself. About the quality of his attention, the specificity of his vision, the way he had held a piece of metal and understood it as a story rather than a component. He said, Howard believed that a car was not a product. He believed it was an argument made in steel and rubber and combustion, about what mattered and how it should move through the world. This car is that argument. It survived 40 years of neglect and misattribution, and one very determined order to have it destroyed. And then someone found it and cared enough about what it was to save it, without knowing what it was worth, which is the only reason it exists today. He paused, then added, Howard would have liked that detail. The bidding opened at $800,000. It moved fast, the way bidding moves when multiple people want the same thing, and none of them are accustomed to not getting what they want. 1 million, 1.8, 2.4, a pause at 3 million, brief, while 2 bidders on opposite sides of the room took the measure of each other. 3.7, 4.1, a new bidder entered at 4.5, who had not been active until then, and the room absorbed this with the collective attention of a crowd watching a chess game at a critical moment. 6 million, 7.2, another pause, longer this time, during which the auctioneer said nothing, and the room said nothing, and the number sat in the air like a fact that had not yet decided whether it was finished. 8 million, a counter from the back of the room. 9.5. The first bidder withdrew. A woman 3 rows behind Marcus leaned forward in her seat. An older collector near the aisle stood, and then sat, and then stood again, the way people move when they are watching something that the body cannot quite process as stillness. 2 phone lines represented by members of the auction house staff, seated at a long table to the side, headsets on, speaking in low and rapid cadences, had remained active throughout. One of them now raised a hand. The auctioneer acknowledged it without expression. 11 million. The room made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was the sound of a number that had crossed a threshold people had speculated about but not quite believed. 11.6. From the floor. 11.9 from the phone. 12 million even. A paddle raised near the back by a man in a gray suit who had not bid since 9 million and had apparently been waiting for precisely this moment. $12,300,000. The hammer came down. The room made a sound that was not quite applause and not quite silence, a collective exhalation, a release of held breath, the sound of a number being absorbed. Then the applause came, and it was sustained and genuine, the kind that does not require prompting or coordination. Marcus sat very still for a moment. Then he stood, because people were standing, and because it seemed appropriate to be upright when the weight of something this large settled around you. He thought about the salvage yard, about Gerald in his oil-stained cap, saying, "Thursday, it's getting crushed. You want to look first?" About the flatbed depositing the wreck in his driveway, about his neighbor's expression and the teenagers on their bikes, about Lily asking if their car counted as old, about the lamplit garage in the quiet hours, the socket wrench and the wire brush and the patience that was not patience, so much as simply not knowing how to quit on something that deserved to be finished. He thought about Howard Bledsoe, who had sat across a workbench from him for 2 years and shown him, without ever explaining it directly, that the value of a thing and the price of a thing were not the same thing, and that a man who confused the two would spend his life making someone else rich. He had not confused the two. At the back of the room, Victoria Hale stood in the shadow near the exit doors. She had come alone. She had not registered with the auction house. She had told her assistant she was taking the afternoon for personal matters. She watched the hammer come down, and she watched the room rise to its feet, and she watched Marcus Reed stand in the middle of all of it, with the same expression he had worn in the hotel driveway, not triumph, not vindication, simply presence, simply being exactly where he was without apology or performance. She waited until the formal proceedings ended, and the room began to disperse. She moved through the crowd carefully, not drawing attention, until she was close enough to speak. Marcus turned before she reached him, the way certain people have a sense of being approached that operates independently of their hearing. He looked at her. She stopped a few feet away. Around them, people were moving, talking, the noise of aftermath filling the space. Neither of them moved. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, but mean despite the rehearsal. "What I said in the driveway, how I spoke to you. I was wrong. I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I want you to know that I know that." Marcus looked at her for a moment. There was nothing performative in his expression. No pleasure in her discomfort. No inclination to extend it. He simply looked at her and appeared to consider what she had said as genuinely as he considered anything. "All right," he said. She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. The all right was complete in itself, not acceptance exactly, not dismissal. Simply an acknowledgement that the thing had been said and received, and did not require further elaboration from him. "What will you do?" she asked. With what happened today, I already know," he said. "I've known for a while. What Marcus did, in the months that followed, was not what anyone who followed the story expected. He had not been known before the auction, and he made no effort to become known after it. He gave 2 interviews and declined 40 more. He did not move to a different neighborhood. He did not buy a different car. He bought a building, an old repair shop on the east side of the city, 3 blocks from where he had grown up, in a part of town where the roads cracked at the edges and the street lamps flickered on cold nights. He had the building renovated, not luxuriously but well, with the emphasis on utility and durability that characterizes work done by people who actually intend to use what they are building. He opened a workshop. A school, really, though he did not call it that. It was a place where people who worked with their hands could learn to work better, young people and older people and people in between, people who had been told by various institutions and systems and assumptions that the particular knowledge housed in engines and chassis and mechanical systems was not the kind of knowledge that deserved serious investment. The city had no shortage of such people. They turned up in the first weeks, some referred by word of mouth and some who simply walked past the open overhead doors and stopped and asked what was happening here. Marcus told them the same thing each time. He told them it was a place to learn how to fix things. He told them everyone was welcome. He told them to come back with their tools if they had tools, and to come back without them if they did not, because tools could be acquired. Marcus hired 3 instructors, one of whom had been a student of Howard Bledsoe's at a technical college in the 1990s. He covered costs for students who could not cover them. He set up a small scholarship that paid for tools and materials for young apprentices in the trades. He named the workshop after Howard Bledsoe. Leonard came to the opening, which was a quiet affair, attended by the people Marcus knew and no one else in particular. He stood in the middle of the shop floor, surrounded by the smell of metal and lubricant, and looked at a framed photograph of Howard Bledsoe that Marcus had hung above the tool cabinet, and he was quiet for a long time. "You know what people thought they were bidding on today?" he said finally, though he said it to the photograph as much as to Marcus. "A car," Marcus said. "They thought they were bidding on a car." Leonard shook his head slowly. They were bidding on a story. A story about what happens when someone with real ability is patient enough to wait for the truth to surface. That's rarer than the car. He paused. Howard would have hated all of this. The auction, the attention. He would have complained about it for weeks. Yes, Marcus said. He would have been proud of you, though. Very quietly, and probably only once. But he would have said it. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking at the photograph. He already did, he said. A long time ago. The garage was lit that night. All the fluorescents on, the overhead doors open to let in the evening air. 2 vehicles were inside, one being examined by a young apprentice who had shown up 3 days before the official opening and asked if there was anything he could do to help, and one covered by a canvas tarp in the far corner, a shape beneath the canvas that suggested rust and age and a kind of dormant patience, waiting for the right person with the right tools and the particular variety of care that does not need to know a thing's price in order to understand its worth. The young apprentice asked about the covered car. Marcus told him it was next. The apprentice asked how Marcus knew it was worth working on. Marcus thought about that for a moment, and then he said the thing he always said when someone asked him how he knew, the thing that was not a strategy or a philosophy but simply the truth of how he operated in the world. You look at it, you feel the metal, you understand what it was trying to be, and then you make the decision about whether it deserves the chance to be that thing. The apprentice wrote that down. He did not have to. It was the kind of thing you remember. Outside, the city moved around the lit garage, the way cities move around things that are not yet famous but will be indifferently, rushing past, too busy with its own momentum to notice the light in the window. The light stayed on. The work continued. The covered car in the corner waited quietly, as neglected things do when someone has finally promised to come back for them.